Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, today I want to speak to you about humrat, or humras in Judaism. What is a humrah? A humrah is a stringency. If you're not familiar with the term, depending how good your Hebrew is, you may have heard it said differently. To be machmir, or perhaps lehakmir. Now, the opposite of humrah in Judaism is a kula, or lehakel, to be make, or to be lenient. Now, you're probably thinking, what's the issue? The more you take upon yourself, the better, and, better safe than sorry, right? And friends, that's the issue. That more is not always better, and better safe than sorry could really be endless. And that our time, from an ethical perspective, is a lot more valuable than we may think it is, especially if we have completely enveloped our lives holding by so many worthless, made-up, unauthorized stringencies that we can't properly focus on the mitzvot that matter most. Now, this last statement is what's really going to rub frummies the wrong way, and that's the notion that some mitzvot, or even halachot, are more important than others. Now, many will then quote the famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that states, "Be careful with a minor mitzvah as with a major one, for you do not know the reward for the mitzvot," which at its outset is telling us to try not to distinguish between the minor and major mitzvot, stating that there is a scale, and one mustn't forget that even this statement is also regulated to commentary and is not in any way authoritative, because as a matter of fact, the Rambam here comments that we do at least know which negative mitzvot are more important based on the onish, or the punishment accompanied with the failing to observe them laid out in Torah Shebiktav. So friends, I believe that the major confusion that exists in the Jewish world is due to the liberal influence of moral relativism. And again, I'm speaking about the Orthodox Jewish world, which, like I said, has been infected by moral relativism. That is actually at the core of what makes the movement, unfortunately, socially and ethically irrelevant today. Almost completely redefining the purpose of the mitzvot in the first place. Not as what they were meant to be, as tools to physically better this world, but rather into some sort of credit system that as long as you accrue as many credits as possible in any area, like being machmir by Chalav Yisrael, rather than taking care of the orphan, the widow, or the convert, then the same global impact is made. To the point that we even see this in the way we learn Torah nowadays, or the way we encourage our children to learn Torah. In other words, learning Torah is not, as the Rambam taught us, as a way to learn the permissible from the forbidden, or sensitizing us to embrace a loving God. No, but it's now just people going over tons of Talmudic arguments that have no bearing in halakha, but just are used to help the students learn how to argue. Again, moral relativism, customs and stringencies created only to further Israel from the world they're supposed to be inspiring. And honestly, one could also say that humrat, or stringencies, have really become the opiate of the religious Jewish world. Again, desensitizing us from our greater task at hand, which is, of course, nothing less than impacting this world through ethical monotheism. And friends, I don't want you to think that this is just my opinion. It actually appears all over Talmud Bavli and even Talmud Yerushalmi. It states, Kol she'edu mitzvah dedavar v'suechu nikra hediot, that anyone exempt from a matter and does it is called a hediot. It's called a layman, or even possibly an idiot. And for one case, it gives the example of someone remaining in the sukkah when it's raining. Now, we know that we're not required to sit or dwell or even sleep in the sukkah when it's raining, al pi halacha. And dwelling in the sukkah is a din d'oraitos. So this teaches us that it's not only because something may be rabbinic that we're not required to go above and beyond. And if we do, we're seen as hediotot. But no, friends, the prohibition stems even for Torah commands. Now, what does this really mean? Does it mean that anyone who goes above and beyond what's even commanded in Torah is an idiot? No, not at all. I mean, it can't mean that. However, I do think that it's a warning telling us of the error of possibly doing too much and becoming so involved in the ritual that you miss the whole ethic of it all. Teaching us that the correct path does not lie on either side, that doing too much and in the same sense too little will both get you missing the mark. And of course, this inyanon ve'osehu nikra hediot is really just talking about certain commandments and not all of them. Now, many of you are thinking, how can someone do too much? And like we said, this is the general consensus in the Jewish world today. And friends, the whole reason we have this concept of Ve'osiehu Nikra Hediot are for the mitzvot and halachot that act as support for the important mitzvot and halachot that directly affect others. Also known as mitzvot ben adam lechavero, commandments between man and man, unlike mitzvot ben adam lemakom, commandments between man and God. And friends, this understanding between the mitzvot needs to really be ingrained in your minds before we can go further. The difference between the mitzvot, sometimes equally separated as hukim and mishpatim. And this line of thinking really boils down to the fact that the Almighty ultimately cares more about the way we treat each other than the way we treat Him. In other words, you must know that there is nothing you can give God. He doesn't need your praise or your love. What He needs for you is to listen and to obey every mitzvah in the Torah. And realize that every command is either physically affecting or preparing you to physically affect someone else. Which should tell you that ethical thought must really be accompanied with Torah in order to make it meaningful and purposeful, especially for others. And not do as the Rambam explained in Mor Nevuchim, to be like those who keep commandments like they're chopping wood. Now, this is not a new concept of different degrees of mitzvot. As a matter of fact, the halakha teaches us that when confronted with one of the mitzvot aseh, the positive commandments, or a mitzvah lo taseh, or a negative command, and if one only had the ability to do one should do the positive command first. And this, my friends, is why I believe that religious people have chosen to ignore or play down their obligations to their fellow man. And one, it's because they're failing to emulate the Almighty, the way He behaves towards us. How? By making Hashem an idol in Himself. In other words, the basis of the Judaic ethical monotheistic system is that our God is first and foremost an altruistic, loving God. In other words, goodness is His calling card. And like any loving parent, He cares more about how we treat each other than how we actually treat Him. And that's it, my friends. Now, from a halachic perspective, we see this first mentioned by Rabbeinu Tam in Masechet Gittin. Now, we know that Rabbeinu Tam is not one of our mumchim, but I bring him down nonetheless to show you that this topic, the topic of humrot, was still properly understood even in the medieval Ashkenazi world. So, on the sugya, on whether tefillin requires shear to the lines, the impressions made on the parchment, in other words, something that would take an extra step that would consume more of our time, Chazal ruled that they didn't require shirtut. So here Rabbeinu Tam quoted that famous statement in the Yerushalmi, that anyone not commanded to do something and yet does it is called an idiot. So, in other words, not that it is an opinion to be strict, how it's understood and done today, and even the notion of Hidur Mitzvah, which I'll discuss in a bit, but that if the halacha is not to do it, that you shouldn't do it. Now, Talmud Bavli says the same in a softer manner. It says in Kedushin, Goda mitzuve ve'oseh mimish yenu mitzuve ve'oseh. One who performs out of command is greater than one who performs uncommanded. Now, I've heard this misquoted many times to in some way teach that if a Jew keeps a mitzvah and a non-Jew keeps the same mitzvah, the Jew will get more credit because he is supposedly commanded to do so. Nonsense. That thinking only permeates among those who believe that the physical keeping of mitzvot is not what betters the world, which is not how Chazal understood it. Actually, the notion that only Israelites were commanded to keep the mitzvot and not non-Jews who are interested in joining Israel is a strictly rabbinic idea based on the fact that only an Israelite would be held liable in a Jewish court. So the notion of ethics is never mentioned here. So in other words, the inyan that one who performs out of command is greater than one who performs uncommanded is really reiterating what was said in Talmud Yerushalmi in the first place, that those who choose to waste their time expanding or expounding on halachot when they are patur, and not patur of alasor, but just exempt, that they're just acting silly, unenlightened, and plain. And another example brought down is when reclining haseba during the Pesach Seder, how some people are patur from haseba like a student in front of his Rebbe. It states that if a Talmud wants to be machmir, al pi halacha, he's also called an idiot. So, I mean, the sources are endless, my friends. And another makor for this inyan appears in a famous story brought down in Yerushalmi in Masechet Brachot. It states that Rav Yossi and Rav Shmuel were eating a meal together, and then suddenly it came time to daven. So the Gemara says that Rav Shmuel got up to daven in the middle of the meal. Now, we know that the halacha is that if you start Suda, a meal before Zman Tefillah, before you have to pray, and then prayer time arrives, you're not obligated to daven. And then it goes further. It states that Rav Yossi says, didn't you teach us that anyone not commanded to do something and yet does it is called an idiot? So why are you trying to be machmir? Now, many of you out there will try to quote the Perka Avot that tells us that we should build fences around the Torah. First of all, this is one problem with people nowadays who just open up a Mishnah and think that everything there applies to them or their leaders today. And the reason I'm saying this is because that statement in Perka Avot is a statement said by Chazal for Chazal, who not only had the obligation but the responsibility to develop ceremonial laws to protect the mitzvot in the Torah, and in no way was ever a license to become so heavenly good that you're no earthly good, with countless of insignificant stringencies instituted by yourself or your rabbis today, which is actually amazingly what the Rashbats on that parak in Perka Avot tells people to do, to invent their own fences. Can you believe that? And friends, you will really see that it is not till the Rishonim and the Achronim that this notion of Humrot or stringencies really takes off. And the truth is that it wasn't really till the time of the Rishonim that Judaism really splits, and not just because of the creation of the Zohar or what we call Kabbalah today, but in our case with the blurring of what or who was held as authoritative in Judaism. In other words, with the idea that it was a positive thing that one should institute his or her own fences to the Torah, especially at the expense of more important mitzvot. And this sentiment of creating stringencies in our daily lives is continued most famously by the Ramchal in Mesilat Yesharim in the Path for the Just. And I honestly think that this work by the Ramchal is one of the Sforim that really impacted the idea within the crazies in Judaism today, which is another reason one has to really know what they're studying. In other words, only because it's sold in a Judaica or in the Jewish section in Barnes & Noble does not mean that it speaks for Judaism. But regardless, he states in Perek Yud Gimel in Midot HaPrishut, it states that there is a concept in Torah of prishut, of abstaining, that one should abstain or should make oneself holy with what is mutar or permitted to him. And this is the gateway to Hasidut, to piety. In other words, with activities that are perfectly allowed, one should establish their own personal set of humrot or stringencies. And this here is taught by the Ramchal as something that's praiseworthy, completely opposite of what we learned by Chazal. And really, it was just a downhill spiral from the 13th century on. And friends, there's no doubt that the reason the idea of Humrot skyrocketed post the era of the Rishonim was mainly due to the writings and influences of the Zohar and Kabbalah in general after 1270 of the Common Era, when it was written, that actually challenged people to escape reality and focus on what's inside instead of worrying how our actions may affect others, which is the real purpose of Judaism all along. And friends, it's also no surprise that another huge source that has been responsible for the nonsense of Humrot that we see in the Jewish world today is found in the Chabad Shulchan Aruch and the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Again, no surprise here. It states regarding the statement in the Yerushalmi found in Masechet Shabbat regarding Nikrei Hediot, that when someone forms a Humrah because of a Chidur mitzvah to make it mechuder, to beautify the mitzvah, even though you're patur or exempt, this is not called a hediot. Now, my friends, that's a bold statement, especially on so much that we just learned by Chazal on this issue. Actually, when a statement like that is said without further explanation, it really just opens the floodgates for the weirdness and asceticism we see in the Jewish world today. I mean, this statement completely nullifies anything that could be labeled as acts of a fool, honestly. Now, the notion of a Hidur mitzvah does exist, friends, but it needs to be explained a little more carefully. It's actually equivalent to telling someone who suffers with OCD that better safe than sorry with any area in their life, and teach this as a principle, or giving an alcoholic the keys to a bar. How? Because, friends, it's in our religious nature to fall into gaiva, into haughtiness, to look down or act holier than others around us. But anyways, look, just stop and think for a second. Do you think that this is really a problem in the Jewish world today? Or do you think that Rabbi Asher Meza is just making this up? That someone's hat is never big enough, or their beard is never long enough, or their coat is never black enough, when we're never commanded to wear hats, beards, or coats? Are you beginning to see what I mean? Now, what's the outcome? What does Kol She'enu Mitzvah Dedavar Ve'Yosechu Nikrei Hediot really mean? Friends, it means that you must guard your time wisely, because it's limited. And realize that the only thing that makes the world physically better is the keeping of mitzvot. And that's all. And yes, some mitzvot are more important than others. And how do you know which mitzvot are more important? Easy. Mitzvot that affect your fellow man are more important than mitzvot performed for God to see. As a matter of fact, we'll just look at the everyday prayer book, including Shabbat and holidays. Look how thick it is, when it really just has to be this thick. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Or when I see someone in a Shabbat table basically not eat because they insist on holding by some supposed stricter hashgacha. Not that the meat is not kosher, but they just want to be different. I mean, it's just ridiculous that when I see Jews putting on 2 pair of tefillin in the morning, thinking that in some way their chumrah is bettering the world. And if they don't think this, then why do it then? Why waste that time where they could in turn use that time more productively? And friends, if you're hearing me today and you're interested in becoming Jewish or just interested in learning everything about Torah Judaism, please visit doordea.com. Thank you.